The doctor's office smelled like antiseptic and old paper, a place where answers were supposed to arrive neatly labeled. The mother sat with her hands folded in her lap, rehearsing apologies for wasting everyone's time. Her daughter's weight gain, the nausea, the exhaustion, stress, hormones, another misdiagnosis. That was what she told herself. It had to be. There were rules the world followed, lines that could not be crossed, and this was one of them. When the doctor finally spoke, the room seemed to tilt. The word hung in the air, absurd and immovable, refusing to soften. Pregnant. The mother waited for laughter, for a correction, for someone to say they'd mixed up the files. But there was only the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and her daughter's distant gaze, unfocused, unaware of how the ground had just disappeared beneath them. On the drive home, the house loomed larger than it ever had. Every window looked like an eye. Every door felt like a question. The mother replayed years of routine in her mind: mealtimes, medications, caregivers, family visits, searching for a moment she could pull apart and examine. She had built her life around protecting her child from a world that did not understand her. And yet the unthinkable had happened without a scream, without a bruise, without a single clear warning. That night, the mother lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the home settling. Pipes creaked. Floorboards sighed. Each noise carried a new weight, as if the house itself was trying to confess something. She realized with a chill that pregnancy did not arrive by accident, and silence was not proof of safety. Someone had known. Someone had been close enough to touch, to hide, to return again and again without leaving a trace that spoke loudly enough to be believed. By morning, the mother understood the most terrifying truth of all: whatever had been done to her daughter had not come from outside. It had grown quietly within the walls she trusted, wearing the face of normal, waiting for her to notice far too late. The first sign came quietly, almost politely, the kind of change that could easily be explained away if someone wanted to keep believing everything was normal. The mother noticed her daughter's clothes fitting differently, fabric pulling tighter around the waist where it never had before. At first, she blamed inactivity, a side effect of medications, the natural fluctuations doctors had warned her about over the years. Her daughter's disability had always come with a long list of possible symptoms, and weight gain was one of the safest explanations. Safe explanations were comforting. They kept panic at a distance. Then came the tiredness. Not the usual fatigue that arrived in predictable waves, but a deeper exhaustion that settled into her daughter's body and refused to leave. She slept longer, moved slower, and sometimes stared into space as if listening to something no one else could hear. The mother adjusted routines, reduced stimulation, increased rest, all the things she had learned to do through years of careful caregiving. She told herself this was just another phase, another medical puzzle they would eventually solve together. What unsettled her most were the small physical complaints her daughter could barely articulate. A hand pressed to her stomach. A soft whimper at night that stopped as soon as the light came on. When asked if something hurt, her daughter would nod sometimes, shake her head others, her communication unreliable and fragmented. The mother documented everything, as she always had, trusting that the system would recognize a pattern if one existed. Doctors had repeatedly assured her that pregnancy was not a possibility, that her daughter's condition and supervision made such a thing virtually impossible. But the mother felt something shifting beneath those reassurances. Instinct crept in where logic failed. She began to watch more closely, noticing changes she might once have ignored, a swelling that did not recede, a sensitivity to smells, sudden nausea that came without warning. Each sign on its own was meaningless. Together, they formed a picture she refused to look at directly. Accepting it would mean accepting that something forbidden had occurred under her roof. She oscillated between denial and dread, scolding herself for even considering such a thought. The world was cruel, but it followed rules, she believed. Her home was controlled, structured, monitored. There were locks, schedules, trusted faces. Yet as the days passed, reassurance felt thinner, like paper stretched too tight. Every glance at her daughter carried a question she was afraid to ask out loud, because asking it meant admitting that protection had failed in the most unimaginable way. The appointment was meant to be routine, the kind that fit neatly into a calendar already crowded with checkups and follow-ups. The mother brought her daughter in with a practiced calm, armed with notes and observations, expecting another adjustment, another explanation rooted in medication or metabolism. She had learned long ago how to sit patiently under fluorescent lights, how to translate her daughter's limited responses into something doctors could understand. This visit was supposed to be no different, just another stop in a long, familiar process. When the nurse asked questions, the mother answered automatically, barely listening to the words herself. Appetite changes, fatigue, abdominal discomfort. Each response felt harmless when spoken out loud, stripped of the private dread that had been growing at home. The examination took longer than usual. There was a pause, then another test ordered, then a silence that stretched beyond comfort. The mother noticed the way the staff avoided her eyes, how their movements became careful, deliberate, as if the room had suddenly become fragile. The doctor returned with a folder held too tightly. The mother watched his face, searching for clues, for reassurance, for anything that resembled the predictable outcomes she depended on. When he spoke, the explanation came gently, wrapped in medical language, but the meaning cut through instantly. The confirmation landed with a dull finality that left no room for argument. Pregnancy was not a possibility to be discussed. It was a fact already established, already progressing, already irreversible. The mother felt herself detach, as though the room had moved several feet away. Her first instinct was to correct him, to list reasons why this could not be true. Her daughter's condition. The supervision. The constant presence of family or caregivers. The safeguards she had put in place over years of vigilance. She waited for the doctor to acknowledge the mistake, to explain how the test could be wrong, but instead he spoke of timelines, of next steps, of care plans that assumed acceptance. Her daughter sat quietly beside her, unaware of the weight pressing down on the space between them. The mother reached for her hand, grounding herself in something real, something she could still touch and protect. Questions crowded her mind faster than she could form them into words. How long? How? Who? Each unspoken thought felt louder than the last, echoing against the walls of the small room. As they left the clinic, the world outside seemed unchanged, unbearably normal. Cars passed. People laughed. Life continued without pause. The mother realized then that certainty could be more terrifying than doubt, because doubt allowed hope, while certainty demanded answers she was not ready to face. Once the diagnosis settled into reality, the next question arrived immediately and without mercy, hovering over every thought like a shadow that refused to move. The doctors asked it carefully, gently, as if softening the words might make them safer. Who was the father? The mother felt her throat tighten, not because she did not want to answer, but because she already knew she could not. She looked at her daughter, searching her face for recognition, for fear, for any sign that a memory might surface on its own. There was nothing she could grasp, only the same distant calm that had always made the world underestimate how much her daughter understood and how much she could not express. Attempts to communicate felt like walking through fog. Simple questions produced uncertain reactions, nods that meant yes one moment and no the next, silence where words should have been. The mother tried pictures, gestures, familiar routines, anything that had worked before, but this was different. This was not about choosing a meal or pointing to a place on a page. This required language her daughter did not possess and memories that might not exist in a form that could be retrieved. Each failed attempt deepened the mother's sense of helplessness. What terrified her most was the absence of visible distress. Her daughter did not cry when questioned. She did not recoil or cling. She simply existed, untouched by the urgency that consumed everyone else. That calmness, once a comfort, now felt like evidence of something far worse. It suggested repetition, normalization, a violation so woven into routine that it no longer registered as wrong. The mother wondered how many moments had passed unnoticed, how many opportunities she had missed to see what her daughter could not explain. Professionals spoke in careful tones about limitations, about the likelihood that her daughter might never be able to identify what had happened or who was responsible. The words felt clinical, detached from the devastation they carried. Without a name, without a face, the threat became abstract and therefore everywhere. Anyone could be responsible. Everyone became suspect. The home, once a place of controlled safety, transformed into a maze of unanswered questions. Silence filled the gaps where truth should have been. It sat heavily between the mother and the people around her, infecting conversations with tension and unspoken fear. She replayed interactions endlessly, scrutinizing every smile, every offer of help, every moment her daughter had been alone with someone else. The inability to identify the father did more than stall an investigation. It erased certainty itself, replacing it with a constant, gnawing awareness that the person who had done this was still hidden behind familiarity, still close enough to touch, still protected by the very silence that made her daughter so vulnerable. The mother began to dismantle her days, pulling them apart hour by hour, searching for a gap where the impossible could have slipped through. At first, she told herself this was unnecessary, that her routines were solid, dependable, built on years of vigilance. Her daughter's life had always been structured to the minute, every medication, every meal, every rest period accounted for. But once the certainty of pregnancy existed, routine no longer felt like protection. It felt like camouflage. She started with mornings, tracing the familiar rhythm of waking, dressing, breakfast. She remembered moments when she stepped away briefly, trusting the quiet of the house, assuming safety in absence of noise. Then she moved through afternoons, therapy sessions, home visits, relatives stopping by unannounced. Each memory that once felt ordinary now carried a faint distortion, like something viewed through cracked glass. She realized how often other people had been present, how many times she had been grateful for help without questioning its cost. Evenings unsettled her most. Fatigue made vigilance weaker then. There were times she cooked while someone else sat with her daughter, times she showered with the door unlocked, listening for sounds that never came. She had equated silence with peace, never considering that silence could also mean compliance, fear, or confusion. The thought lodged painfully in her mind that harm did not require force loud enough to be heard. As she retraced these moments, she understood a truth that made her stomach turn. Her daughter was never truly alone, but she was never truly protected either. Access was constant. Familiar hands passed her water, adjusted her clothing, guided her to bed. Touch was normalized, necessary, unquestioned. The boundaries that existed for others had always been blurred for her daughter, disguised as care. That realization felt like betrayal, even though no one had yet been named. The mother began noticing how often doors had been closed without her presence, how easily time slipped away in 5 or 10-minute intervals that left no trace in memory. She thought of how trust had been distributed freely, not out of carelessness, but out of exhaustion. Years of caregiving had taught her to accept help wherever it appeared, to believe that shared responsibility meant shared protection. Now, every recollection tightened into suspicion. The house no longer felt like a single space, but a series of blind spots she had never mapped. Each room carried echoes of possibility she wished she could erase. The realization that someone had not needed secrecy or opportunity, only proximity, stripped away the last illusion of control she had held onto, leaving her with the unbearable knowledge that the danger had been woven into the everyday fabric of their lives. With her routines laid bare, the mother's attention narrowed to the people who had moved through those hours with ease, the ones whose presence had once brought relief rather than concern. Faces she trusted rose to the surface of her thoughts, and with them came memories that now felt altered, reshaped by what she knew. There was one person in particular whose behavior began to replay differently in her mind, scenes rewinding and slowing until small details grew heavy with meaning. She remembered how this person always volunteered, never asked. How they insisted on handling the more intimate parts of care, brushing aside her offers to help with an ease that once felt considerate. At the time, she had been grateful. Caregiving drained her in ways she rarely admitted out loud, and anyone willing to step in felt like a gift. Now, gratitude curdled into something darker as she recalled how often those offers came when no one else was around. The glances came back to her next. She had noticed them before but dismissed them without effort. Lingering looks that seemed unfocused, casual, easily explained as concern or distraction. Only now did she remember how her daughter sometimes stiffened when those eyes lingered too long, how her gaze would drift away, her body growing still in a way the mother had mistaken for calm. It was easier then to interpret silence as comfort than to imagine fear she could not hear. Time alone began to trouble her most. She remembered how often this person positioned themselves between her and her daughter, how naturally they occupied space, closing doors, lowering voices. There had always been a reason. Privacy, dignity, efficiency. Words that sounded responsible, even compassionate. The mother realized how willingly she had stepped back, trusting that care meant protection, not vulnerability. She examined conversations she had once forgotten within minutes. Jokes that felt slightly off, comments about her daughter's body framed as medical or observational, remarks that unsettled her briefly before exhaustion pushed them aside. None of it had seemed alarming on its own. Together, they formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. A pattern of comfort with closeness, of entitlement disguised as concern. The realization did not arrive as certainty, but as a growing pressure in her chest. She did not want to believe it. Belief would mean acknowledging that trust had been misplaced in the most devastating way. Yet denial now felt like complicity. Each memory sharpened into suspicion, and the mother understood that the truth might not come from a dramatic revelation, but from the quiet accumulation of moments she had once forgiven too easily, moments that now refused to stay buried. Once suspicion took root, the past began to reorganize itself around it, revealing details the mother had dismissed as meaningless at the time. Small disturbances surfaced first, the kind that barely registered when life was already crowded with responsibilities. She remembered doors she hadn't closed, finding them locked anyway, keys turned softly without explanation. When she asked, there were always reasonable answers. Safety, privacy, habit. She had accepted them all, relieved to have order rather than questions. Schedules were another thing she revisited. There had been days when routines shifted subtly, appointments moved, caregiving duties swapped without discussion. At the time, flexibility felt necessary, even kind. Now she saw how unpredictability created openings, moments when oversight blurred and accountability dissolved. Her daughter had been passed from one set of hands to another so often that no single moment felt distinct enough to stand out. There were also changes in her daughter's behavior she had chosen not to interpret too deeply. Periods of withdrawal that came and went, sudden resistance to certain tasks, an unexplained reluctance to enter specific rooms. The mother had labeled these as mood fluctuations, sensory overload, symptoms that required patience rather than interrogation. She remembered how quickly she redirected instead of pressing, how she praised calmness without questioning its cause. Nighttime memories unsettled her the most. There had been evenings when her daughter woke crying softly, stopping the moment she was held. No fever. No visible pain. The mother had chalked it up to bad dreams, discomfort she couldn't express. She recalled times when her daughter startled at unexpected touch, then relaxed just as quickly, as if her body had learned to respond automatically. That automatic response now felt ominous, learned rather than natural. Objects, too, began to carry weight. Clothing folded differently than she left it. Items slightly out of place. A blanket changed. These things had never alarmed her because they existed within a shared space, touched by many. She realized how easily evidence could hide in normalcy when nothing was being actively sought. Normal had protected whatever was happening far better than secrecy ever could. Each rediscovered detail tightened into a pattern that felt undeniable. None of it screamed danger. That was the cruelest part. It whispered. It blended. It relied on the assumption that harm announces itself loudly. The mother understood now that the signs had been there all along, scattered and subtle, waiting for a context she had never wanted to imagine, waiting for a moment when ignoring them was no longer possible. The confirmation came not as an accusation, but as a careful, measured statement delivered in lowered voices and clinical terms. Medical professionals spoke to her with a gravity she had never heard before, their language precise, deliberate, stripped of comfort. They explained timelines, developmental markers, biological certainties that did not bend to circumstance or misunderstanding. What they were telling her was simple and devastating. This could not have happened once, and it could not have happened by accident. The mother listened as they described patterns consistent with repeated exposure, the kind that develops over time rather than through a single event. Each word felt heavy, as though it carried more meaning than it was willing to reveal outright. They did not need to describe acts for her to understand the implication. The body, they explained gently, remembers repetition even when the mind cannot articulate it. The signs were there, embedded in physiology, immune to denial. She felt something inside her harden as the possibility of innocence evaporated. There was no longer room for theories rooted in error or misunderstanding. This was not a rare medical anomaly. It was not a mistake in testing. It was evidence of intent, of someone choosing to return again and again without fear of being stopped. The realization shifted her grief into something sharper, more dangerous. It introduced the word abuse into her thoughts, a word she had avoided because once spoken, it could never be taken back. The professionals spoke about consent in careful, legal terms, emphasizing what the mother already knew but had never wanted to confront directly. Her daughter could not give it. The power imbalance was absolute. Whoever was responsible had known that, had relied on it, had counted on silence and dependency as shields. The system acknowledged this with protocols and procedures, but no framework could soften the truth that someone had exploited vulnerability with purpose. What unsettled the mother most was the certainty in their voices. There was no hesitation, no ambiguity left to cling to. The way they looked at her carried quiet urgency, as if they understood that the danger might not be confined to the past. Abuse of this nature, they implied, rarely stops on its own. It continues until it is interrupted. As she left the room, the mother felt the weight of responsibility settle fully onto her shoulders. The question was no longer whether something terrible had happened, but how long it had been happening and whether it was still happening now. The confirmation stripped away the last of her protective disbelief, replacing it with a single, terrifying clarity that whatever had been done to her daughter was deliberate, sustained, and carried out by someone who believed they would never be discovered. Confrontation felt necessary, inevitable, yet terrifying. The mother knew she could no longer pretend that questions were optional or that silence was protection. She began quietly, observing the household as if seeing it for the first time. Faces that had once been familiar now seemed opaque, masks hiding intentions she could no longer trust. She called people together one by one, her voice controlled but sharp, demanding answers without accusation, hoping for honesty, fearing deception. Each denial she received tightened the air around her, thickening it with tension that made every movement feel weighted, every glance a potential threat. She started with the person who had seemed the most unsettling in retrospect, the one whose actions and glances had once been dismissed as helpful or affectionate. The conversation began casually, almost conversationally, as though she could coax truth out of familiarity. But the answers were always careful, rehearsed, clipped. Eyes avoided hers, voices lowered, smiles forced. Every denial became a wall between what she knew in her gut and what the world around her insisted was impossible. The absence of confession made the house feel smaller, claustrophobic, as though each corner hid secrets she had not yet uncovered. Her daughter's presence made every exchange unbearable. She sat silently nearby, sometimes glancing up, unaware of the tension, her body betraying no hint of the storm around her. The mother felt an ache she could not name, a mixture of sorrow, rage, and helplessness. She realized that even if someone admitted guilt, it would not erase the trauma or restore the trust that had been broken. Denials, though hollow, were a shield for those responsible, a reminder that evil often wears the guise of normalcy. As the confrontations continued, the mother began to notice subtle tells, slight hesitation in speech, hands fidgeting, eyes darting toward the daughter in ways that seemed rehearsed. But nothing was overt, nothing that could be acted upon without evidence. She understood that the danger was not only in what had been done, but in the ability of the guilty to manipulate perception, to maintain innocence while inflicting harm. Every lie, every refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing, amplified the fear that the situation was far from over. The mother felt the weight of isolation pressing down. Those who might have supported her, trusted her, or simply understood her perspective seemed unable to pierce the wall of denials. Even allies offered only cautious advice, warning her to proceed carefully, to gather proof before accusation. But proof was elusive, hidden in plain sight yet protected by everyday routines and unremarkable appearances. The confrontation revealed not just the denials, but the terrifying truth that the people she had relied on for clarity and help were either complicit or indifferent, and that uncovering the full scope of what had happened might demand more than courage, it might demand shattering the very foundation of her home. The breakthrough arrived in the form of a detail so small it might have been overlooked by anyone else, a fragment of ordinary life that had always existed but never seemed significant. At first, the mother didn't recognize it for what it was. A misplaced object, a muffled conversation overheard while passing through a hall, a gesture too fleeting to interpret at the time. Alone, these moments had felt inconsequential, mere background noise in the rhythm of daily life. Together, they formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. She replayed the memory of that misplaced object endlessly, tracing its journey through her home. Why had it been moved? Who had touched it? At the time, she assumed simple human error, but now she saw intention. There were other moments that seemed trivial on their own, a casual remark whispered in passing, a hand lingering too long on the arm of her daughter, the precise timing of when people came and went. Each small anomaly began to align, like pieces of a puzzle forming a picture she had been too afraid to assemble. The mother retraced her steps through the home, walking slowly, noticing what she had once ignored. Doorways, corners, spaces that had seemed ordinary now carried weight. The timing of interactions, the way certain rooms were used, the habits of those around her, everything began to reveal a map of access, opportunity, and silence. She realized the perpetrator had relied on familiarity and routine, exploiting trust in the most mundane ways to avoid detection. As the pieces came together, clarity emerged with a terrifying sharpness. The evidence had always been there, hidden in plain sight behind normalcy, waiting for someone to pay attention. Each overlooked detail now felt like a message, a trail left by someone who believed they were clever enough to go unnoticed. The mother felt a shiver of horror as she understood that the small, seemingly insignificant signs were the key to unraveling what had been done to her daughter. The mother's mind raced through possibilities, connecting observations that had seemed unrelated. She traced lines between gestures, conversations, and movements, seeing intent where she had once seen benignity. The invisible architecture of deception became visible, each small clue a thread leading her closer to the person responsible. The realization was overwhelming. Someone had carefully orchestrated access and opportunity, relying on the very trust and routine that had once made her feel secure. This discovery forced her to confront a new, unbearable truth. The danger had not been random or isolated. It had been calculated, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life, and anyone who did not know to look would never see it. The tiny clues, once dismissed, were now irrefutable, pointing her toward the unthinkable reality that had been lurking quietly in her home all along. The realization hit her with a force that left no room for hesitation. The danger was not confined to the past, and every moment of inaction could allow it to continue. She understood that protecting her daughter would require more than careful observation or quiet suspicion. It would demand confrontation, exposure, and a willingness to shatter the fragile illusions that had once kept the household functional. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her chest, a relentless reminder that someone close had violated the very space she had considered safe, and that person might still move freely among them. Every decision now carried unbearable consequences. To act meant risking escalation, anger, or retaliation from someone who had already proven they could manipulate trust. To wait meant prolonging her daughter's vulnerability, allowing harm to continue unchecked. The mother's mind raced, cataloguing possibilities, weighing risks against the urgent need for protection. The thought of involving authorities filled her with dread. Bureaucracy could be slow, questions could re-traumatize her daughter, and exposure might leave them both isolated. Yet inaction felt like complicity, an intolerable silence in a situation where silence had already allowed harm to thrive. She began to examine every detail of the home again, not for past clues this time, but for future safety. Locks, alarms, cameras, even the positioning of furniture became part of a strategy she had never imagined needing. She mapped out who had access, when, and for how long, considering each person's potential motives, habits, and proximity to her daughter. It was exhausting, mentally and emotionally, but necessary. The mother understood that the smallest oversight could have catastrophic consequences. Every choice had to be deliberate, precise, unflinching. Alongside logistics came the emotional calculus. Trust had been broken in ways she could not undo. She could not rely on familiar faces, could not assume anyone's presence was benign. The mother felt a cold clarity settle in. Safety could no longer be assumed from routine or habit. Her daughter's vulnerability required vigilance that extended beyond the ordinary limits of caregiving, vigilance that might isolate them from the world they had once navigated with confidence. And yet, amid fear and urgency, the mother also recognized a flicker of resolve. There was no alternative path, action was necessary, and protection must be prioritized above all else. She understood that confronting the truth, no matter how devastating, was the only way to reclaim some measure of control, to stop harm from continuing, and to ensure that the person responsible could no longer exploit innocence and trust. The knowledge that the decision could reshape every aspect of their lives made it terrifying, but also necessary, because inaction had already proven too costly, and the safety of her daughter could not wait another moment.